The dust-laden sunlight cast long shadows across Prescott, Arizona on that sweltering summer day in 1878, when Grace Davis's life changed forever. Standing before Reverend Whitmore, she never imagined that her refusal to marry the town's richest cattle baron would end with her imprisonment in the very church where she'd once found solace. "You'll reconsider, Miss Davis." Reverend Whitmore's voice was cold as he turned the key in the heavy oak door. "Mr. Barton is a generous man, and his patience has limits. A few days of contemplation should help you see reason." Grace lunged for the door, her amber eyes flashing with defiance. "You can't do this. This is madness." But her protests fell on deaf ears as the door slammed shut, the lock's mechanism sliding into place with a sound that echoed through the empty church like a death knell. At 22, Grace had already weathered more storms than most. Orphaned at 16, when influenza took both her parents within a week of each other, she had kept her family's modest dressmaking shop running through sheer determination. Her skill with a needle had earned her respect in Prescott, but it had also caught the unwanted attention of Harold Barton, a man 30 years her senior who controlled half the businesses in town and seemed determined to add her to his collection. Grace pounded on the door until her fists ached, then slid to the floor, her calico dress pooling around her. The realization of her predicament settled over her like a shroud. The church stood on the outskirts of town, far enough away that her cries would go unheard. Sunday was 5 days away. If Reverend Whitmore meant what he said, no one would come until then. "I will not break," she whispered to herself, rising to her feet. "I will not be forced." Her immediate concern was water. The June heat was unforgiving and dehydration would kill her before starvation. She made a thorough inventory of her prison. The main chapel with its rows of pews, the pulpit, a small vestibule, and the reverend's study. In the study, she found a pitcher with perhaps 2 cups of water. It would have to be rationed carefully. Food was another matter. There was none to be found, save for the communion wafers locked in a cabinet she couldn't access. Grace knew the reverend's intent weaken her body to break her spirit, make her desperate enough to accept Barton's proposal. Night fell, bringing little relief from the heat. Grace slept fitfully on a pew, using her petticoat as a pillow. By morning, her throat was parched, and she allowed herself only the smallest sip of water. She tried the windows, but they were too narrow to climb through and too high to reach without something to stand on. The pews were too heavy to move alone. She spent the day searching for any means of escape, stopping occasionally to rest when dizziness overtook her. By the evening of the second day, half her water was gone, and hunger gnawed at her belly. She thought of her little shop, of the blue silk she'd been cutting for Mrs. Henderson's daughter's wedding dress. Would anyone notice her absence? Would anyone care? Miles away at the Rocking R Ranch, foreman Lucas Riley was growing concerned. The delivery of shirts he'd ordered from Grace's shop was now 2 days overdue. It wasn't like her to miss a commitment. Lucas had known Grace since she arrived in Prescott as a child, though their paths had rarely crossed until recent years when he began placing orders for the ranch hands. "Something's not right, Pete," Lucas told his ranch hand as they finished the evening chores. "Miss Davis is reliable to a fault." "Maybe she's taken ill," Pete suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. "Maybe." But Lucas couldn't shake his unease. At 30, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was wrong. The next morning, Lucas rode into town. Grace's shop was locked, with no sign indicating where she might be. He asked at the general store, the saloon, even the doctor's office, but no one had seen her for days. "Might ask Reverend Whitmore," suggested the barber. "Saw him talking to her outside the shop few days back. seemed intense. Lucas frowned. He'd never much cared for Whitmore, finding the man's sermons on submission and divine hierarchy too convenient for those already in power. Still, it was the only lead he had. Inside the church, Grace was growing weaker. The water was gone by midday of the third day, and her hunger had transformed from a sharp pain to a dull, constant ache. Worse than the physical discomfort was the silence. It pressed in on her from all sides, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk outside or the settling of the building in the heat. To maintain her sanity, she began to sing softly, songs her mother had taught her. When her voice grew too dry to continue, she recited poetry from memory. Anything to fill the oppressive quiet. By the fourth day, Grace was drifting in and out of consciousness, her lips cracked and bleeding. She had tried everything, breaking the windows with a hymnal, too thick and solid. Prying open the door with a candlestick, too weak. Even trying to set a controlled fire with the altar candles to attract attention. The flames refused to catch on the stone floor. Her strength was failing, and with it, her hope. Lucas rode to Reverend Whitmore's house, a modest dwelling behind the church, only to find it empty. The neighbor woman, hanging laundry, mentioned that Whitmore had gone to Phoenix for a few days, something about a meeting with the bishop. "When did he leave?" Lucas asked, his concern deepening. "Monday morning, I believe. Said Sunday's sermon is already prepared should he be delayed. 4 days. Grace had been missing for 4 days. Lucas's unease bloomed into full-blown worry. He walked around the church, peering through the stained glass windows, but they were too cloudy and high to see anything clearly. On impulse, he tried the door. Locked, of course. Churches in these parts were often left open during the day, but Whitmore had always been particular about respecting the Lord's house. Lucas pressed his ear to the door, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a sound, a human sound. "Hello," he called. "Is someone in there?" Inside, Grace heard a voice. At first she thought she was hallucinating, her mind conjuring comfort in her final hours. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Help," she tried to call, but her voice was a rasp, barely audible to her own ears. Summoning what little strength remained, she crawled to the door, each movement an agony of effort. She lifted her hand and, using the last of her strength, banged it against the wood. Once, twice, Lucas heard the faint thuds. "I'm going to get you out," he called. "Hold on." He ran to his horse and grabbed his rope. The church door was solid oak, built to withstand both the elements and potential intruders. But Lucas hadn't spent 15 years breaking wild horses without learning a few things about leverage and force. Looping one end of the rope around the door handle and the other around his saddle horn, he urged his stallion forward. The door creaked but held firm. Lucas adjusted the angle and tried again. This time, the frame splintered slightly. One more pull, and the lock tore free from the wall with a shriek of protesting metal. Lucas dismounted and rushed inside. The dimness after the bright Arizona sun momentarily blinded him. As his eyes adjusted, he made out a figure crumpled on the floor just inside the door. Miss Davis. He knelt beside her. "Grace," she looked up at him with glazed eyes, her face pale and drawn, lips parched and cracked. Recognition flickered in her gaze. "Mr. Riley," she whispered. Lucas didn't waste time with questions. He scooped her into his arms, alarmed at how light she felt, and carried her outside. His canteen hung from his saddle, and he uncorked it with one hand, holding it to her lips with the other. "Slow sips," he cautioned as she drank desperately. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Grace nodded weakly, forcing herself to take measured sips. The water was like life itself flowing down her throat. After a moment, she pulled away. "Thank you," she managed. "What happened?" Who did this to you? Lucas's voice was tight with controlled anger. Grace closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. Reverend Whitmore, he locked me in, said I needed to reconsider Harold Barton's proposal. She looked up at Lucas, a flash of her usual spirit returning. I refused to marry him. Barton, I mean. The Reverend took it upon himself to change my mind. Lucas's jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors about Barton's interest in Grace, but he hadn't realized the man would go to such lengths. Let's get you to Doc Wilson, he said, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward town, Grace leaned against his chest, too weak to sit upright. Lucas was acutely aware of her fragility, of how close she'd come to death. The thought of it kindled a rage unlike any he'd felt before, directed at both Whitmore and Barton. Doc Wilson took one look at Grace and ordered bed rest, fluids, and small, frequent meals. Starvation and dehydration, he pronounced gravely. Another day would have been too late, I fear. With no family in town, Lucas insisted Grace stay at the widow Perkins's boarding house, where he paid for a month's lodging in advance. I'll be checking in daily, he told the widow, who nodded approvingly. Don't you worry about a thing, Mrs. Perkins assured him. I'll see she gets proper care. While Grace recovered, Lucas took action. He rode to the sheriff's office and reported what had happened. Sheriff Taylor was skeptical at first. Reverend Whitmore was a respected figure, and Harold Barton's influence ran deep. But when more than one person recalled seeing the Reverend escorting a reluctant Grace toward the church days earlier, he agreed to investigate. By the time Reverend Whitmore returned from Phoenix 2 days later, he found the sheriff waiting. His protests of innocence fell apart when confronted with the broken church door and Grace's testimony. The scandal rocked Prescott, dividing the town between those who believed a woman had the right to choose her husband, and those who felt Grace was being stubborn in refusing such an advantageous match. Harold Barton was furious. He stormed into the widow Perkins's boarding house a week after Grace's rescue, demanding to see her. She's not receiving visitors, Mrs. Perkins said firmly, blocking the doorway. Stand aside, woman, Barton growled. That girl owes me an explanation. She owes you nothing, came a calm voice from behind him. Lucas stood on the porch, his hand resting casually near his holster. I suggest you leave, Mr. Barton. Barton turned, his face flushing with anger. This isn't your concern, Riley. You're nothing but a hired hand. I'm making it my concern, Lucas said evenly. Miss Davis has made her feelings clear. A gentleman would respect that. You dare lecture me about being a gentleman, Barton sneered. I could buy and sell you 10 times over, boy. Probably, Lucas agreed, but money can't buy everything. Now, I won't ask again. Leave. For a tense moment, Barton seemed ready to push the confrontation further. Then, with a final glare, he turned and stomped down the street toward the saloon. Thank you, came a soft voice. Grace stood in the doorway behind Mrs. Perkins, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the summer heat. She was still pale, but her eyes were clearer now, more alert. Lucas tipped his hat. Madam, feeling better, I hope. Much thanks to you. She stepped onto the porch, Mrs. Perkins hovering protectively nearby. I haven't properly thanked you for saving my life. No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same. Grace's smile was sad. We both know that's not true. Many in this town would have left me there if it meant pleasing Harold Barton. Lucas couldn't deny it. Barton's influence was far-reaching, and those who crossed him often found themselves facing financial ruin. Well, I'm not most people, he said finally. No, Grace agreed softly. You're not. In the weeks that followed, Grace slowly regained her strength. Her shop remained closed. She wasn't ready to face the public scrutiny. But she began sewing again in her room at the boarding house. finding solace in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Lucas visited daily, initially just to check on her recovery, but soon their conversations extended beyond polite inquiries into her health. They discovered shared interests in literature and music. Grace learned that beneath the cowboy's rugged exterior was a thoughtful man who read poetry by lamplight and could discuss the works of Emerson and Thoreau with surprising insight. "My mother was a schoolteacher," he explained when Grace expressed surprise at his literary knowledge. "She insisted on education even after we moved west, said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean our minds had to be frontier as well." Grace smiled. "She sounds like a remarkable woman, is she?" "Passed on 8 years ago. Fever took her and my father both within a month of each other." "I'm sorry," Grace said, reaching out to touch his hand briefly. "I lost my parents to influenza 6 years ago." "I remember," Lucas said quietly. "I was at the funeral. You wore a blue dress with white lace at the collar." Grace looked at him in surprise. "You were there. I don't recall seeing you. I stayed at the back. Didn't know your folks well, but they were good people. Your father always tipped his hat to my mother when we passed on the street. Small thing, but it meant something in those days." Their shared experiences of loss created a bond between them, deepening with each visit. By the time Grace was strong enough to reopen her shop, their friendship had blossomed into something more, though neither had put it into words. The town's reaction to their growing closeness was mixed. Some, like Mrs. Perkins and Doc Wilson, approved. Others whispered that Grace was setting her sights too low after refusing Barton. A few suggested Lucas was merely interested in Grace's property. The shop was one of the few buildings on Main Street not owned or controlled by Barton. "Let them talk," Grace said one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "I've learned the hard way whose opinion should matter to me." Lucas nodded, though the whispers bothered him more than he let on. Not for his sake, he'd never cared much for town gossip, but for hers. Grace had already suffered for her independence. He didn't want to be the cause of more hardship. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future." Grace tensed slightly. "Oh, the ranch owner's getting on in years. No family to speak of. He's offered to sell me a stake in the Rocking R. Small share now, with the option to buy more later." "Lucas, that's wonderful. You've earned it." Grace's genuine pleasure in his news warmed him. "It would mean I could offer more stability," he continued, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. Grace reached out and took his hand. "Are you trying to say something specific, Mr. Riley?" He looked up then, caught by the teasing warmth in her eyes. "I'm saying that I find myself thinking of you at the most unexpected moments. When the sun rises over the mountains, I wonder if you're watching it too. When I break a new horse, I imagine telling you about it later. When I read something interesting, I save it to share with you." He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I love you, Grace Davis, and if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I would like that very much," she whispered. "In fact, I've been hoping you would ask." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of deeper affection to come. As Lucas held her, he marveled at the strength in her slender frame, a woman who had faced death and emerged not broken, but more determined than ever to live on her own terms. Their courtship was the talk of Prescott that fall. Lucas formally escorted Grace to church, a different church now, as Reverend Whitmore had been replaced following his arrest, and to the harvest dance. He brought her wildflowers from the high country and books ordered specially from back east. She sewed him shirts finer than any cowboy had a right to wear and packed picnic lunches for their Sunday rides. But the path of true love rarely runs smooth, especially in a town like Prescott. Harold Barton had not forgotten what he saw as a double humiliation: Grace's rejection and Lucas's interference. As winter approached, he began making moves against them both. First came the notice that Grace's lease on the shop would not be renewed. Though she owned the building, Barton owned the land beneath it, a common arrangement in western towns. Without a lease, she would have to move her business. "He can't do this," Lucas fumed when Grace showed him the notice. "He can," Grace replied calmly, "but I won't let it defeat me. I'll find another location." But Barton had anticipated this. Suddenly, no property in the business district was available for rent, at least not to Grace Davis. Shopkeepers who had been friendly for years now avoided her gaze when she inquired about space. Meanwhile, Lucas faced problems of his own. The bank unexpectedly called in a loan he had taken to purchase his share of the ranch. When he protested that the terms gave him 3 years to repay, the banker merely shrugged and mentioned changing circumstances. "It's Barton," Lucas told Grace as they walked along the creek that ran behind the boarding house. "He's on the bank's board of directors." Grace's face was troubled. "This is my fault. If I had just..." "Don't," Lucas interrupted firmly. "Don't even think it. What Barton and Whitmore did was wrong. You have every right to choose your own path." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, I've weathered worse. I'll find a way to raise the money." But as December brought the first snows, their situations grew more dire. Grace's shop would have to close after Christmas, and Lucas had exhausted his options for financing. Their friends rallied around them. Mrs. Perkins offered Grace reduced rent to continue working from the boarding house, and the ranch owner extended Lucas's deadline, but these were temporary solutions at best. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. Lucas had spent the day helping a neighboring ranch round up strays before the weather worsened. He returned to town that evening, looking forward to the small celebration he and Grace had planned, only to find the boarding house in an uproar. "She's gone," Mrs. Perkins cried when she saw him. "Left not an hour ago with that snake Barton." Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean, gone? Why would she go with him?" "He came with papers. Said he'd foreclose on her shop immediately, take everything unless she agreed to his terms." Mrs. Perkins wrung her hands. "I tried to stop her, told her to wait for you, but she said there wasn't time." "What terms?" Lucas demanded, though he feared he already knew. "Marriage," the widow confirmed grimly. "He's taking her to his ranch outside town, said the Reverend would perform the ceremony tonight." Lucas didn't wait to hear more. He ran to his horse, still saddled from his ride into town, and spurred it toward Barton's ranch. Snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the landscape in white, but Lucas knew the way. He'd ridden past the Barton spread often enough. A sprawling property with a house that seemed designed more to impress than to provide comfort. As he approached, he could see lights blazing from every window of the main house. He dismounted at a distance, tethering his horse to a tree, and approached on foot. Through a window, he could see Barton in the parlor, a glass of whiskey in hand, speaking to a thin man who looked vaguely familiar. Not Whitmore, who was still awaiting trial, but another preacher from a neighboring town. Grace was nowhere in sight. Lucas moved around the house until he found a side entrance. The kitchen was empty, the staff apparently given the night off. He slipped inside, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. From the kitchen, he could hear Barton's voice more clearly. "Should be ready soon. Women and their preparations, you know. Reverend, help yourself to more brandy." Lucas made his way upstairs, careful to avoid the creaking steps. The upper floor was dimly lit, with several doors leading off a central hallway. He listened at each one until he heard movement behind the third door on the right. Knocking softly, he whispered, "Grace." The movement inside stopped. After a moment, the door opened a crack and Grace's wide eyes peered out. "Lucas," she gasped, "what are you doing here?" "If Barton finds you, I'm taking you home," he said firmly. "Get your things." "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "He has the deed to the shop. He'll take everything my parents worked for, and he said he'd have you arrested if I refused, something about rustling charges." Lucas's jaw tightened. "He's bluffing. And even if he's not, no shop is worth your happiness. No amount of money or property is worth that." Grace hesitated, torn between the legacy her parents had left her and the future she wanted with Lucas. "He's powerful, Lucas. He could destroy us both." "Let him try." Lucas took her hand. "Grace, I'd rather face whatever comes with you by my side than live safely without you, but it has to be your choice. It always has to be your choice." For a moment she stood frozen, uncertainty in her eyes. Then, with a decisive nod, she grabbed her shawl. "Let's go." They moved quietly down the hallway, but as they reached the top of the stairs, a floorboard creaked loudly beneath Lucas's boot. "What was that?" came Barton's voice from below. "Jenkins, check upstairs." "Run," Lucas whispered, pulling Grace toward a back staircase he'd noticed earlier. They made it to the kitchen just as heavy footsteps sounded on the main stairs. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, providing cover but also making travel more treacherous. "My horse is this way," Lucas said, leading her through the swirling white. Behind them, shouts erupted from the house. "They're outside. Find them." Lucas helped Grace onto his horse, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he urged, turning the animal away from the road and toward the open country beyond. They rode hard through the gathering storm, the sound of pursuit fading behind them. Lucas knew these lands better than Barton's men. He'd worked them for years, in all seasons. He guided his horse along a creek bed where the water would hide their tracks, then up a ridge that offered a sheltered approach to town. "We can't go back to Prescott," Grace said, shouting to be heard over the wind. "It's the first place they'll look." Lucas nodded. "I know a place. Old Line Shack about 10 miles north. Used it during roundups years back. Should still be stocked with basic supplies." The ride was grueling. The temperature dropped as night deepened, and the snow made it difficult to maintain their bearings. Grace, still weakened from her ordeal months earlier, began to shiver violently despite being wrapped in Lucas's coat. Finally, just when it seemed they might have to stop and seek shelter beneath a stand of pines, Lucas spotted the outline of the Line Shack against the night sky. "Almost there," he encouraged, feeling Grace's head drooping against his chest. The shack was crude but solid, with a small stove, a narrow bunk, and shelves stocked with canned goods and basic staples. Lucas quickly built a fire while Grace huddled beneath the single blanket he'd found. "It's not much," he apologized, opening a can of beans to heat on the stove. "It's perfect," Grace replied, her color slowly returning as the shack warmed. "It's freedom." They ate in comfortable silence, the howling wind outside making the simple shelter seem cozy by comparison. "What now?" Grace asked finally, setting aside her empty plate. Lucas stoked the fire before answering. "We could head for California or Colorado. Start fresh where Barton has no reach." Grace considered this. "Run, you mean? Call it a strategic retreat," Lucas suggested with a half-smile. "At least until we're in a stronger position." But Grace shook her head slowly. "Running would mean he wins, that everything he believes about power and money, being able to buy anything, including people, is right." She looked up, determination hardening her gaze. "I don't want to run, Lucas. I want to fight." Lucas studied her face, seeing not just the woman he loved but a partner he respected. "All right," he said finally. "We fight. But not alone. There are others in town who have suffered under Barton's thumb, people who might stand with us if someone just took the first step." They spent the night planning, huddled together on the narrow bunk for warmth. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a world transformed by snow. They rode back toward town, taking a roundabout route to avoid Barton's ranch. Their first stop was Sheriff Taylor's office. The lawman was surprised to see them, having already heard Barton's version of events that Grace had agreed to marry him only to steal valuable items and flee with her cowboy lover. "That's a lie," Grace said firmly. "I went with him under duress to save my property and protect Lucas from false charges. He was going to force me to marry him." Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Davis. Mr. Barton is a prominent citizen." "So were my parents," Grace replied, "and so am I." "Does wealth determine who gets justice in Prescott?" The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "No, madam, it doesn't, but without evidence." "I have evidence," Lucas interrupted. "Letters from other ranchers who have had run-ins with Barton, threats, fraud, intimidation. I've been collecting them for months, ever since what happened to Grace at the church. Figured they might be needed someday." Sheriff Taylor's eyebrows rose. "That would certainly be worth looking into." By noon, word had spread through town that Grace and Lucas had returned and were challenging Barton openly. A crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office, growing as the afternoon wore on. Some came out of curiosity, others out of support, and a few Barton's allies to jeer. Inside, the sheriff reviewed the evidence Lucas had gathered. "This is troubling," he admitted. "Very troubling indeed, but Barton has friends in high places, the territorial governor included." "The governor isn't above the law," Grace pointed out, "and neither is Harold Barton." Before the sheriff could respond, the door burst open. Barton himself stood there, flanked by two hired guns. "There they are," he snarled. "Arrest them, Sheriff. Theft and trespassing for starters." Sheriff Taylor stood slowly. "Mr. Barton, I was just reviewing some interesting documents concerning your business practices. Perhaps you'd like to discuss them." Barton's face flushed. "Whatever lies they've told you aren't lies," came a voice from the doorway. "Mrs. Perkins pushed past Barton, followed by several other townspeople. "We're all here to attest to that." What followed was a remarkable scene. One by one, residents of Prescott stepped forward to tell their stories. The baker whose rent had tripled overnight when he refused to extend credit to Barton. The widow who had lost her husband's mining claim through suspicious clerical errors. The young couple whose wedding had been delayed 3 times because the preacher kept finding scheduling conflicts, until the bride's father agreed to sell his prime grazing land to Barton. As the testimonies mounted, Barton's bluster gave way to cold calculation. "This is absurd," he said finally. "A conspiracy of failures and malcontents. I've brought prosperity to this town." "You've brought fear," Grace corrected quietly. "That's not the same thing." The confrontation might have ended there, with Barton retreating to marshal his considerable resources for a protracted legal battle. But fate had other plans. As he turned to leave, one of his hired guns, perhaps misinterpreting a gesture, perhaps simply eager for violence, drew his pistol. Lucas moved faster, shoving Grace behind him and drawing his own weapon. The hired gun fired, the bullet grazing Lucas's arm. Before he could get off another shot, Sheriff Taylor had his shotgun leveled at the man's chest. "Drop it," the sheriff ordered. When the man complied, Taylor turned to Barton. "Harold Barton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, intimidation, and now attempted murder." "This is outrageous," Barton spluttered. "I didn't order him to shoot." "Maybe not," the sheriff agreed. "But you brought armed men into my office with the intention of intimidating witnesses and obstructing justice. That's enough for now." As Barton and his men were led to the cells in the back, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. Grace hurried to Lucas's side. examining his wounded arm. "It's just a scratch," he assured her, though the blood seeping through his shirt suggested otherwise. "Let Doc Wilson be the judge of that," she insisted, leading him toward the doctor's office. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Barton faced multiple charges, with new witnesses coming forward daily as people realized they no longer needed to fear his retaliation. The territorial authorities sent investigators, and several of Barton's business associates hastily severed ties. Grace reclaimed her shop, and with Barton's influence neutralized, many of his property holdings reverted to their rightful owners. The atmosphere in Prescott shifted noticeably, as though a dark cloud had lifted from the town. Lucas recovered quickly from his wound and set about securing his partnership in the Rocking R. The ranch owner, impressed by his foreman's courage in standing up to Barton, offered even more favorable terms than before. Through it all, Grace and Lucas grew closer, their love deepened by the trials they had faced together. They were married that spring in a simple ceremony at the new church, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Perkins cried openly, claiming she'd known from the start they were meant for each other. As they exchanged vows, Lucas couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with an act of cruelty, Grace, locked in a church to starve, had led to a love stronger than either of them could have imagined. "I never thought I'd be thankful for being imprisoned in a church," Grace admitted later that evening as they sat on the porch of their new home, a modest but comfortable house halfway between town and the ranch. Lucas squeezed her hand. "I'm not thankful for your suffering, but I am grateful that it led me to break down that door. My hero," she teased, though her eyes were serious, "though I think we both know I would have found a way out eventually." "Without a doubt," he agreed, "but I'm glad I got there first." 10 years later, Grace and Lucas Riley were fixtures in Prescott society. The Rocking R had prospered under Lucas's management, eventually becoming his entirely when the original owner retired to California. Grace's dressmaking shop had expanded to include a small department store, the first in the territory to be owned by a woman. They had 3 children: Thomas, their 8-year-old son who had Lucas's quiet strength and Grace's quick mind; Elizabeth, a spirited 6-year-old with her mother's amber eyes; and Robert, their youngest at 3, who seemed determined to climb everything in sight. Harold Barton had served 5 years in the territorial prison before being released, broken in health and spirit. He left Prescott without a backward glance, rumored to have returned east to live with a distant relative. On the anniversary of Grace's rescue, the family always had a private celebration. This year, as they sat around the dinner table, Thomas asked the question they'd been anticipating. "Papa, is it true you broke down a church door to save Mama?" Lucas glanced at Grace, who nodded slightly. Their children were old enough now to understand, at least in part, the story of how their parents met. "I did," Lucas confirmed. "Your mother was locked inside by people who thought they could force her to do something against her will." "Were you scared, Mama?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes wide. Grace considered her answer carefully. "Yes, I was, but I was also determined, and I knew that someone would come for me. You couldn't have known Papa would find you," Thomas pointed out, ever the logical one. "Perhaps not him specifically," Grace agreed. "But I believed that good would triumph eventually, and it did." She reached across the table to take Lucas's hand. "It always does in the end." As they gazed at each other across the table surrounded by their children, both remembered that moment when the church door had splintered open, letting in light and air and hope. It hadn't been the end of their struggles, but it had been the beginning of their life together, a life built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and enduring love. Later that night, with the children asleep, Lucas and Grace stood on their porch, looking out at the stars sprinkled across the Arizona sky. "Any regrets?" Lucas asked, wrapping his arm around her waist. Grace leaned into him, considering the path that had brought them here: the loss of her parents, the imprisonment, the confrontation with Barton, and all the joys and challenges that had followed. "Not one," she said finally. "Every step, even the painful ones, led me to you and this life we've built. How could I regret that?" Lucas kissed her then, as tenderly as he had on their wedding day. In the distance, a coyote howled and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods along the creek. Prescott had changed over the years, growing from a rough frontier town into a more established community. But some things remained constant: the beauty of the land, the strength of true partnerships, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. "No regrets," Lucas echoed, holding his wife close as the night deepened around them. "Just gratitude for each day and the promise of all the days to come." And in that moment, as they stood wrapped in each other's arms under the vast Arizona sky, both Grace and Lucas knew with absolute certainty that breaking through that church door on the fifth day had not just saved a life, it had created one, a shared life more beautiful than either could have imagined alone.